Welcome to the Bourbon Van. I'm Phil.
I'm Julie, and this is how to host your own bourbon tasting.
Well, with the holidays upon us, many of you are hosting for family and friends, whether it's a party or a small get-together, whatever it might be. And if you're like me, you don't want to play cards or games or anything like that. There's got to be something more interesting to do, and we've done several of these tastings over the last year, and we've learned some things, and we think that this is one of those things for your guests that provides a little bit of a different experience and also introduces them to some flavors that they may not be familiar with. And we're going to walk you through it from start to finish, from recommendations for glassware to whiskeys to what to have after, because it's not going to take up your entire party, but it should take up a little bit of a chunk of time. What we want is for you and your guests to have a great time, to try some delicious whiskeys, and ultimately for them to give you a hug at the end of the night and say, that was the best party I've ever been to. Don't get your hopes up that much. We'll see what we can do.
So this does not have to break the bank, but let's talk glassware.
Yeah, absolutely. Glassware, a critical component of a good tasting, and you don't have to line up 3 or 4 whiskeys in front of your tasters all at one time. You can do them one after another, which is how we generally do it. Otherwise, you're buying a lot of glassware if you want to have the same glassware for everyone and the same type of glassware. What we recommend is the Glencairn glass. Now, these glasses are specifically designed to deliver aroma up the nose, and the bulb there gathers all the flavors, and there's a lot of science to it. You can find it online. I'm not a scientist, but we love tasting our whiskeys out of these Glencairn glasses. They work phenomenally. And if you want one that's got the Bourbon Van logo or our Super Good logo on it, you can find them on our website at thebourbonvan.com. But the bottom line is, if you have good glassware for people, they're going to get a better experience. And ultimately, that's what you want here, because if everybody's got a different shaped glass, they're all going to have a different experience. Some of them aren't going to be so good, most likely. So have the right glassware, whether that's a Norland glass or a Glencairn glass or a Kentucky neat glass or any of these great whiskey tasting glasses, it matters.
You don't need a lot of equipment, but a pen and paper is always a good idea.
Absolutely. If you actually want your tasters to come away from this experience with some idea of what they like when it comes to whiskey, a pen or pencil and a pad of paper for each taster is a great idea. They can make their notes, they can write down what their favorites were, they can put it in their pocket, take it with them.
If they're anything like me, they forget immediately the ones they liked and disliked, so a pen and paper is always a good idea.
Absolutely.
So during the tasting, it's always a good idea to have some snacks and water on hand.
Totally, yeah. So the water is a great idea because between sips, they can cleanse their palate a little bit. And also, if they're really sensitive to proof, they may want to adjust the proof of the whiskey in the glass. And that's okay. So maybe an eyedropper or just a towel if they're going to be pouring water into glasses to try and bring that proof down. Remember, you're dealing with most likely people who don't drink whiskey all the time, or maybe have never drank whiskey before, and we're going to make some suggestions on the whiskeys that would be good for them, but having some water around is a great idea just to make them feel more comfortable with what they're sipping.
When it comes to snacks, you don't want anything with too much flavor. That'll just throw your tasting experience out the window.
If you have something too salty, it will absolutely influence the flavor of the whiskeys being tried. If you have something too sweet, your whiskeys may become bitter. So what we recommend is things like peanuts and almonds, especially unsalted. Corn chips that are unsalted are a great idea. Dried fruits can be a great idea, things like blueberries or cherries, but especially one thing that we really like is chocolate. And you don't need anything too flavorful here. What we actually like to do is just keep some milk chocolate chips around. The cheapest ones you can buy, because for whatever reason, we find that they suit our palates perfectly. We can easily cleanse our palates and get right on to the next tasting with just a little bit of milk chocolate and some water. So there are recommendations out there to go with a whole spread of different chocolates. There's recommendations to go with a charcuterie board with loads of cheeses and meats. You can find recommendations online, but what we like is something more simple. We like some unsalted nuts, chips, maybe a little milk chocolate around, and that pretty much does the trick for us. Finally, the last piece of equipment that I have to recommend is a dump bucket. The last thing you want is for your non-whiskey drinking friends to think that they have to finish every glass. We're not trying to get people loaded here. The idea is you want to make them comfortable with the flavors they're experiencing and see if they can find something new to enjoy. So we recommend having a dump bucket around, especially if they come from a world of wine tasting or that sort of thing.
I've never dumped my wine.
No, well, it's not for everybody.
Before we get to the tasting, let's learn how to nose the glass because I think that's the #1 game changer that I learned over the last year.
Absolutely. In all the tastings that we've done, this is probably the #1 thing that people do not know how to do, and it changes everything for them. So understanding how to nose a glass is the proper introduction once you start pouring these whiskeys. So here's the right idea. You take your glass, raise it gently up to your nose. You rest it on your upper lip. Don't close your mouth, and this is the key. Breathe gently through your nose and mouth. And now you've got bourbon notes on there. Because if you just close your mouth and snort that aroma out your nose, you're getting mostly ethanol, and a lot of people make that mistake. Seriously, most people make that mistake. So teach your tasters to open their mouth, bring in that whole aroma, and now they know what to expect on the palate. Recognizing some flavor notes when they first get started is a huge step in the right direction that will make your tasting a major success. One other thing that's absolutely critical to keep in mind, especially if you're pouring for folks who are not normal whiskey drinkers, do not over pour. It only takes about 3/4 of an ounce of whiskey at most to really become comfortable with the aroma and the palate and to see what you like about a given whiskey. 4 times 1 ounce of whiskey, especially for new bourbon drinkers, is going to probably be too much. So try not to be overly heavy-handed here. You're not trying to get people uncomfortable. That's the last thing we want. The best idea is to underpour, if anything, because at the end of the tasting, when they know what they like, then they can potentially just enjoy a sip of that.
Finally, let's get to the good stuff. It's time to choose your whiskeys.
Absolutely. So there is a method to our madness. You don't have to follow this. You can totally choose your own whiskeys, whatever you want to do. But here's our recommendation, and it all has to do with providing a path for your tasters to experience new flavors, starting with something easy, working your way up from there, so that at the end of this tasting, they'll go to the liquor store and know exactly what they want, or at least some version of what they want. And so that's why it's important to us. For glass #1, we start with something low proof. That means between 80 and 90 proof. That's our recommendation. And for us, that means something like this. This is Benchmark Old No. 8. This is an 80 proof whiskey from Buffalo Trace. There are a ton of them in this area that you can pull from. There's Four Roses Yellow Label, that's 80 proof. There's Evan Williams Black 86 proof, which is actually my favorite, but we don't have a bottle of it on hand right now. There's even any sort of 90 proofers that are okay. Evan Williams 1783, for instance. There's lots of bottles that will work here, but what you want to do is to provide something low proof that has real bourbon flavor. You're not looking for a finished whiskey or a wheated bourbon or anything like that. You want to start with something that has real bourbon flavor to allow their palates to adjust to the flavors that are coming up next.
The next whiskey in your tasting is a bit of a twofer.
Absolutely. So if you follow the channel at all, you know this is no surprise. It's one of my absolute favorite bottles. This is Old Grandad Bonded. So what you're getting here, the reason we chose this as the second whiskey, this is a high rye mash bill and it's bottled in bond. What I like about that is if you're leading a tasting, you have to have something to say. It's gonna take people a few minutes to get familiar with these whiskeys and to see if they like them or not, to taste them, to get the nosing down and all that. So it helps if you have something to talk about. Well, glass #2 here is a high rye mash bill. So a lot more rye here than you would typically find in a bourbon. So that's something that you can discuss and you can teach them about mash bills. Beyond that, it's bottled in bond. You can talk about the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. Might bore some of you, but I think you'll be surprised by how many people are actually going to enjoy the history, especially talking about bottled in bond and why it's important. And they'll see that when they go to the liquor store and they'll recognize that bonded whiskey and know exactly what it is in the future. A little bit of backstory can make your tasting interesting and memorable.
So we got low proof, high rye. How about another twofer?
Absolutely, and this might be the best twofer of the bunch right here. Maker's Mark, you're getting a wheated bourbon. Maker's Mark 46, you're getting a bourbon that's been finished with extra oak staves. So it gives you an opportunity to show them something very sweet, gives you an opportunity to talk about what finished whiskey actually is, gives you an opportunity to talk about a wheated mash bill. And so you've started with a low proof sipper, then you bounced up to that 100 proof, and now you're down to 94 proof with the Maker's Mark 46. Really, any wheated bourbon would do in this instance. What we're trying to highlight here is the difference between mash bills. We want your tasters to experience something completely different, and with Maker's 46, they're definitely going to get something totally different than that OGD Bonded, and hopefully very different than your original 80 proof sipper.
And with the last bottle, let's kick it up a notch.
Definitely. For us, that means let's try a 10-year aged bourbon. This is going to be completely different than anything that they've already tasted. There's going to be a ton of extra character and probably flavor in here. We like Russell's 10 from Wild Turkey. You could go with Eagle Rare if you can find it, from Buffalo Trace. You could go with something like Bullet aged 10 years if that's what you want. But we like this Wild Turkey product because once again, we're at a different distillery now, totally different character, and when something's aged 10 years, it has a unique mouth feel. It's a little richer. This is again 90 proof. This is a low proof sipper. Remember, these are beginner drinkers, so we're trying to introduce them to new flavors that they might like. We're not trying to burn out any palates here. So this bottle right here is a perfect way to round out your 4-bottle tasting.
So much of this tasting comes down to personal preference.
Absolutely. At the end of every tasting, we always ask our tasters, what was your favorite? But inevitably, bottles 2, 3, and 4 split pretty evenly because every palate is different. And the amazing thing about it is at the end of the tasting, people know what they like, especially if they kept any kind of notes or if they really liked something. Now they know the next time they go to the liquor store, if they want to keep a bourbon around the house, they'll have some idea of where to start. And hopefully your family and friends will start to understand your obsession with your whiskey collection a little better.
I doubt it. Finally, in our tastings, we like to offer a little extra credit.
We like to offer a rye whiskey as that 5th sample. And for us, that could be Old Forester rye, it could be Wild Turkey 101 rye, it could be Bullet 95. But the idea here is you just introduced your friends and family to these fantastic world of flavors when it comes to bourbon, and why not introduce them to a rye as well? It's a totally different flavor most of the time. If they don't drink bourbon frequently, it's something they may not even know exists. So it's an opportunity to show them just how different types of whiskeys can be. Now, it doesn't have to be a rye whiskey. It could be an American whiskey. It could be a single malt. It could be Scotch. It could be Japanese. It really could be anything, but we just like to set that differential there so that people recognize that when it comes to whiskey, there are flavors all over the map that they may not be familiar with, and you're helping them to discover them.
When it comes to tastings, we try to make it as accessible as possible.
Definitely. That means whether it's bottles that can actually be found out there or whether it's bottles that are actually affordable. So everything that you've seen today that we've recommended is roughly $35 or less. That's the right idea for a beginner bourbon tasting. Now, obviously, everybody's preference is different, but we do have some experience this year with these tastings. This is what has worked really, really well for us, and we wanted to share that just in case, like us, you don't want to play cards throughout holiday parties at your house. She likes it. I don't understand it.
Finally, there's one more thing that'll make your tasting a success.
Definitely. You've already done the responsible thing by not over pouring. Now, provide a meal for your guests and arrange for transportation to help them get home.
Or maybe open up your house and have an old school slumber party.
Sure, why not? Whatever it is, we want to make sure that each and every one of your guests gets home safely this holiday season. That's really the most important part.
Now it's time to go out there, host your tasting, and let us know how it goes.
Absolutely. And from wherever we are,
To wherever you are.
cheers.
Cheers.